He struck the ground, and by his stripes I'm healed. Poa te whenua, poa te whenua. Jesus was wounded and bruised. He struck the ground, and by his stripes I'm healed. Poa te whenua, poa te whenua.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Rawiri Rau tōku ingoa. The prophecy that you're about to listen to came without warning. It was not rehearsed, neither was it read from a script. At the time that the Spirit of God wanted to prophesy, I recorded it on my dictaphone, and it relates to the city of Christchurch, Ngāi Tahu. Remember when Jacob wrestled and did prevail? He was left with his hip taken out of joint. In that condition of having his hip entirely out of joint is synonymous with Christchurch. Ngāi Tahu's hip has now been taken out of joint. Yet at the same token, Jacob found favour in that condition of having his hip out of joint. My prophecy for Christchurch, Ngāi Tahu, is that her hip is out of joint, yet I speak favour to her. Ngāi Tahu's hip, though out of joint, is of a higher authority before me than when her hip was in joint. The paradox of the scenario for Ngāi Tahu is that though the city's hip is out of joint, yet its strength has been retained. Its character has been retained. Its authority has increased. Ngāi Tahu is Jacob and the position that Jacob hosted when his hip was out of joint. Ngāi Tahu is in a better position than a city whose hip is still in joint. Because a city whose hip is out of joint can still retain the character of a city of credibility. And Ngāi Tahu now will gain, just like Jacob did, the paradox of Jacob to fight an angel, the audacity of Jacob to fight an angel, yet prevailed. Ngāi Tahu has found my favour. I have heard the karakia prayers, and I am turning the city's misfortune into now a city of God's favour. I will use Ngāi Tahu's example not only to forecast what I can do with a city in devastation in this country, but I'm going to forecast through Ngāi Tahu what I can do with a city that's been devastated, but it has been rebuilt because of the glory of the Lord. The graces of the Rose of Sharon and the lily of the valley, those graces have now been extended toward Ngāi Tahu. You have gained favour, Ngāi Tahu. You have gained favour, Ngāi Tahu. You have gained favour, Christchurch. Christ Church. You have gained favour. The promises that I had made to Jacob could only come into play at the point that Jacob's hip was taken out of joint. The promises that I had for Jacob could never ever be reached if he retained his own strength. The promises for Jacob could only be realized at the point that his hip was taken out of joint. The promises that I have for Ngāi Tahu could not be realized whilst Ngāi Tahu was in its own strength, walking in its own pride. That the promises for Ngāi Tahu, which are manyfold, which have been spoken for numerous generations, the promises for Canterbury and Christchurch, these promises will now be realised given that Christchurch's hip is out of joint. I now will bring to pass all the promises. So now it is the time to retrieve the promises that I made, to make me aware of those things that I spoke for your city, Christchurch. Now is the time for you to retrieve those promises of old and start bringing them before me. Your promises will now be realised given that your hip is out of joint. The rose graces of Sharon and the lily of the valley will begin to bloom in Ngāi Tahu, Christchurch.
Jesus was wounded and bruised. He struck the ground, and by his stripes I'm healed. Poa te whenua, poa te whenua. Jesus was wounded and bruised. He struck the ground, and by his stripes I'm healed. Poa te whenua, poa te whenua. Jesus was